Enough already. For a moment, I was about to retort. But I held back those words. How long are you gonna be away from home? The housework is piling up. Get back home already. Maybe because I stayed silent, Bob went on ranting. If you don't come back, I'm divorcing you. I don't need a wife who can't even handle house chores. All I could do in response to Bob's harsh words was to sigh. He doesn't seem to get why I'm silent. It's too late for him to be trying to talk to me now. He should realize it's all because he ignored me. Well, if he had understood that, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. Fine. If he doesn't get it, I'll make him understand. I never intended to forgive him anyway, so this is perfect. I'll teach him a proper lesson. I stared at Bob, snorted with a smirk, and then closed the front door. My name is Catherine Miller. About a year ago, I married my husband, Bob. When we got married, I was 30, so I had been with my maiden name, Thompson, for 30 years. That's why, at first, it felt a bit strange being called Mrs. Miller. But now, being addressed as Mrs. Miller feels more frustrating than strange. There's a reason I feel this way. You see, things haven't been going well with Bob. Hey, what do you want to eat tonight? I tried asking Bob at breakfast. But there was no response. He just glanced at me briefly and then went back to his smartphone. Sigh, he's not talking to me today either. Lately, Bob's been like this all the time. Even when I try to start a conversation, he doesn't respond or answer my important questions. It's because of this ongoing situation that every time I'm called Mrs. Miller, I'm sharply reminded of our marriage and it frustrates me. I can't take this lifestyle much longer. I've been thinking that more and more. Of course, Bob wasn't always this reserved. He used to be kind and cheerful. I first met Bob during his company's corporate trip. I was working for a travel agency at the time, serving as the tour guide for his company outing. That's when we crossed paths. Bob was having a great time with his colleagues. Moreover, he was considerate towards me, their tour guide. Would you like to join us? I'm sorry, I'm on duty right now. Being a guide for a middle or high school field trip often means paying close attention to many details. But in this case, the group was all adults. Nobody was being problematic or hard to manage. Still, it wouldn't have been professional for me to just ditch my responsibilities and have fun with the group. In the end, I declined Bob's invitation and focused on my job. I wondered later if I had made a mistake. However, at the end of the tour, Bob told me this. How about we go out sometime? I'd love to see more of your smile. It took me by surprise. Being a guide, you do get approached often. But nobody had ever been this earnest with me before. All right, let's just exchange contact information for now. I was so thrilled, that was the best response I could muster. We exchanged numbers with my heart racing like a schoolgirl. After that, we started communicating more and eventually started dating. And that led to our marriage a year ago. Looking back now, I feel our days before marriage might have been better. Once we got married, I began to see sides of him I didn't like. You left your clothes out again. Huh? What are you talking about? Bob replied, playing dumb. I picked up the suit he'd left on the sofa. This, Bob. Don't leave it on the sofa. Put it in the closet. Oh, that. My bad. He responded with a chuckle. It just infuriated me even more. He's just like a child. Leaves his clothes everywhere, drops his stuff around the house, and no matter how many times I point it out, Bob just apologizes on the spot. And does the same thing the next day. And it felt like it was getting worse day by day. After our marriage, these irritating habits of Bob became more and more noticeable. Apparently, Bob felt the same about some of my habits. One late night when I returned home after work, he yelled at me. Catherine, there's a pile of laundry. Aren't you washing anything? Yeah, sorry. I'll get to it right away. It's our peak season, and I've been swamped at work. It was during the spring break, and our travel agency was in the middle of its busiest period. There were many trip bookings, and the workload had increased. It's the most lucrative time for a travel agency. So yes, I had been neglecting the housework. I felt bad about it. But I explained to Bob that this was only temporary and things would settle down soon. Just making excuses to be lazy. It's not an excuse. Your company has busy seasons too, right? So what? If it interferes with the housework, maybe you should just quit your job. You're my wife, after all, Bob said condescendingly. At that moment, I was infuriated. I couldn't help but raise my voice in response. What's that supposed to mean? I work too. Shouldn't you be helping with the housework? Why should I do housework? Isn't that the wife's job? We're both working, so we should both pitch in, right? Don't you get it? I confronted Bob, but he just turned away. Then, in a sulking tone, he said, House chores have always been the wife's job, haven't they? You knew that before we got married. Things have changed. Couples work together now. Even though I said this, Bob acted as if he hadn't heard. Eventually, our argument escalated and we slowly stopped talking. A few days later, when I came home, I heard Bob's voice from inside the house. Huh? Is someone over? I cautiously entered the living room and met eyes with my mother-in-law in the kitchen. Oh, welcome back. Hi, why are you here? Well, she sighed before continuing. The story dated back a few hours. As she was preparing dinner, Bob had suddenly called her. Mom, I need your help. Catherine won't do any housework. What? Catherine? She keeps saying it's her busy season, so she's slacking off. I can't even get a decent meal. He apparently said. Of course, that was a big lie. Sure, because it's a busy season, I might not be on top of all the chores. I might do laundry for 2 days in one go. But I do prepare meals and handle the basic chores. So, I defended myself confidently. I sometimes use meal kits, but I still cook the meals myself. Bob interrupted. What's a meal kit? Sounds like a shortcut to me. I might have prepped ingredients, but I still cook everything from scratch. It's still cutting corners. Bob raised his voice, and his mother stepped in between us. After calming Bob down, she turned to me and said, Anyway, it seems you have been struggling, so I came to help with the chores. I see, I'm sorry. Don't worry about it. I bet Bob's just exaggerating. She glanced at Bob, who looked away, clearly unhappy. She then smiled warmly at me. Bob's been complaining, so I'll help with chores during your busy season. But it's okay. Just let me know what you'd like help with. With that said, Bob started devouring the food on the table. Soon after finishing, he promptly retreated to his room. Watching his retreating figure, the mother-in-law turned to me and said, I'm sorry, Catherine. What? Why? About Bob. He's probably not doing much around the house, is he? All I could do was give a wry smile when my mother-in-law said that. Seeming to understand my feelings, she continued. Bob probably called me over just to spite you. To spite me? As I asked for clarification, she sighed before answering. From her perspective, Bob was frustrated with me for cutting corners with the chores while ignoring his own flaws. To get back at me, he probably called her over, thinking that if she came, I'd have no choice but to do the housework properly. No matter how busy I was, I wouldn't be able to slack off. Moreover, she would surely scold me for not doing enough. That's what she guessed Bob was thinking. But contrary to his expectations, my mother-in-law showed understanding towards me. Not only that, she actually blamed Bob. This didn't sit well with Bob at all. That's why Bob's been sulking, she said. But what should I? Just leave him be. He's not a child. She laughed off the matter. But things wouldn't be so easy. Because from that day onwards, Bob stopped talking to me altogether. He wouldn't reply, no matter what I said. He'd even turn away from me. At first, I thought he'd give up soon. But no matter how much time passed, Bob didn't seem to want to speak. And like that, days turned into more days. Eventually a week passed, and before I knew it, half a year had gone by. By that time, I had truly reached my limit. This isn't a marriage anymore, is it? Feeling this way, I decided to file for divorce. After work, I went to a lawyer's office. Then, on a particular weekend morning, I left the divorce attorney's business card on the table and went back to my parents' house. To say I held no grudge against Bob would be a lie. But I didn't want revenge or anything like that. If I got some alimony, that would be fine. That's what I thought. But shortly after, an event occurred that completely flipped my emotions upside down. It happened a week after I left the house. In the middle of the day on a weekend, someone unexpectedly came visiting. I'll get it. Holding back my father who was next to me, I stood up and headed towards the front door. May I help you? I called out to the silhouette standing in front of the entrance. But there was no reply. Wondering who it could be, I opened the door slightly. The moment I peeked outside, I was taken aback. Bob? It was Bob standing there. He was looking intently at me, his mouth a tight line. I immediately shut my mouth. Suddenly, Bob raised his voice. What are you doing here? I was stunned by his outburst. Why is Bob angry? After all the silent treatment, I'm the one who should be mad. Such feelings overflowed within me. And at the same time, anger swelled up. Oh, doesn't Bob realize I'm mad? Well, if he doesn't, I'll make him understand. I decided to express my anger silently. Enough already! For a moment, I almost retorted. But I held back those words. How long are you gonna stay away? The house is a mess, just come back already. Since I kept quiet, Bob continued his tirade. If you won't come back, let's just get divorced. I don't need a wife who can't even do household chores. All I could do was sigh at Bob's harsh words. He doesn't even realize why I'm silent. It's too late to talk to me now. Realize that all of this is because you ignored me. Well, if he had realized it, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. It's fine, I'll make him understand. I never intended to forgive him anyway. I'll make sure he pays for his mistakes. After glaring at Bob, I snorted in derision and shut the door. Hey, Catherine! Don't ignore me! Bob tried to forcefully open the door. I held the door firmly, staying silent. Stop kidding around! Come back now! It was when Bob said that. Noticing the commotion, my father rushed out from the living room. What's going on, Catherine? Dad, please help. I whispered, asking for his help. My father took my place and confronted Bob outside. What do you want? Bob flinched at my father's stern tone. Soon, Bob started to look evasive and began making excuses. Catherine hasn't come home, and she left all the chores behind, so. I've heard all about it. This is your fault, isn't it? No, I didn't really. Bob looked more flustered. My father, pushing him into a corner, told him. You haven't been talking to Catherine, have you? And you came to pick her up? How can you even say that? Well, by not talking to her, you essentially gave up on your relationship. It's too late for regrets now. Bob jumped at my father's booming voice. Bob quickly distanced himself from my father and pointed at me. I'll forgive you now. At your age, you won't have many chances left after a divorce. All bark and no bite. That's the phrase that came to mind. He looked that pathetic. I sighed and retreated further inside the house. You'll regret this, Bob shouted. It was so loud I could hear him clearly inside. Shortly after, my father returned. I asked him about Bob. Where's Bob? He ran off. So, what are you gonna do? I initially planned to leave him be, but I've changed my mind. I'll teach him a lesson and make him truly regret it. I was determined. I was about to contact a lawyer when my phone rang. Huh? A call from Bob? I guess he switched to calling since I ignored him. However, my intention to not talk to him remained. I ignored the call. It ended shortly after. He seems to have given up. Just as I murmured that, the phone rang again. And after that, the calls just wouldn't stop coming in. So persistent. I might as well block him. I blocked Bob's number. I knew he'd figure it out soon, but I didn't care. If he gets the message that I want to ignore him forever, that's enough. That's what I thought. After that, I don't know if Bob realized he was blocked. But he didn't come to the house. And for that, I was relieved. And the next day, I went to work as usual. On the way home, I figured I'd stop by the lawyer's office. I'll discuss the next steps with them. That's what I was thinking while working. Lunch break rolled around, and I stepped out of the office to grab a bite. As I was heading out, a voice called out to me. Catherine! I've been waiting for you! Turning toward the voice, it was Bob. I was taken aback and blurted out. Why are you here, Bob? Catherine, why haven't you come back? You don't answer calls, what the hell are you thinking? Bob ranted loudly, drawing attention. I got flustered. Hey, don't make a scene here. You ignore me in person and over the phone. What choice do I have? He raised his voice, clearly agitated. By now, I was getting really annoyed. All he ever thinks about is himself. Even though this whole mess started because he decided to give me the cold shoulder, I wonder how I could get through to him. Just as I was pondering this, a colleague named Paul emerged from the office. Paul is a male coworker. He's been hitting the gym, and it shows. Noticing the commotion between Bob and me, he stepped in. Is everything okay? Paul asked, concerned. I managed a rueful smile, replying. It's a little complicated. But from the look of it, Paul seemed to get the gist. He stared at Bob and said, Do you have business with one of our employees? Mind your own business. This is between a husband and wife. Husband and wife, huh? Paul gave me a quick glance. I shook my head. Suddenly, Bob yelled. Catherine! Stop lying! We're married, aren't we? No, we're not. We're complete strangers. I snapped back. His face turned beet red with anger. That's a lie! We got married a year ago, and we've been living together ever since. Bob began his rant, looking all high and mighty. I was looking at him with disbelief. Waiting for him to finish, I finally interrupted. Done with your tall tale? What? It's not made up. Well, where's the punchline about us being divorced? Bob looked stunned at my remark. Seeing his expression, I teasingly said, Oh, did you forget that you signed the divorce papers from my attorney? What are you talking about? I didn't sign anything. You did. It was on the papers my lawyer sent. I said in a slightly lower voice. What are you saying? Bob asked in disbelief, so I began to recount the events after leaving our home. The day after I left our home, divorce papers were sent to Bob. Bob might sign it, or he might not. Either way, I thought it was fine. But a few days later, there was a twist. My mother-in-law visited me. Apparently, Bob had asked her to handle the household chores in my absence. She urgently asked about the legal papers. When I told her how Bob had been ignoring me, she became furious. Then, she pulled out the divorce papers. He did something terrible, but he did sign these, she said, urging me to submit them right away. And so, with my lawyer's assistance, the divorce was finalized. And just like that, we were officially divorced. Hearing all this, Bob looked bitter. I never wanted a divorce. Then why did you sign the papers? I was drunk when I did. Bob started making excuses. I was drunk and just signed it for fun. I never really intended to divorce. It was just a game. He went on with his excuses. But once you signed the divorce papers, there's no way those excuses will fly. You really expect anyone to believe that? But Shut it. We're already divorced. If you say one more thing, I'll call the police. I snapped at him. Bob looked down, biting his lip like a child. Just go away. I told him off. Bob turned his back, murmuring, You'll regret this. That's my line. Bob then scurried away. Surely, he's learned his lesson by now. We're officially divorced, and he's the one who signed the papers. He can't object now. I couldn't help but laugh. Later, I thanked Paul by inviting him for lunch. We had an unexpectedly great conversation. After work, I headed to the attorney's office. But then a problem surfaced. Bob might not agree to discuss it. We'll do everything we can, the female lawyer reassured me. But if Bob tries to approach me again, it'll be a nightmare. I emphasized this to the attorney. My job was done. All I had to do now was trust the attorney. I headed home, relieved. But days went by without any contact from the lawyer's office. Instead, something else arrived at my place. It was about 10 days after visiting the attorney, when my distraught father approached me. Something strange was sent to you. He handed me an envelope. It read personal identification notification. What's this? I opened it, and my face turned pale. A marriage application. I immediately called the attorney. explaining the situation. It means someone submitted a marriage application without your consent. Typically, both parties go to the county clerk order's office to submit a marriage application. But one person can submit it too. In that case, the local authority notifies the absent party. That's the personal identification notification. This is to ensure that the marriage application isn't submitted without the other's knowledge. There's only one person who'd do this. It has to be Bob. Infuriated, I reported the matter to the police through my attorney and sought advice. If you file for a marriage annulment mediation, it seems like a hassle, but it's the only way. I had the lawyer start on it immediately. At the same time, I reached out to my mother-in-law, thinking it'd be pointless to contact Bob. Well, the thing is, I explained everything to her, and as expected, she was livid. Bob, get over here. I could hear her yelling at him over the phone, followed by Bob's crying. It wasn't what you think. I did it for Catherine. What are you on about? What you did is a crime. You realize that? But He began to wail pathetically. It was unbearable to hear, so I hung up. The next day, led by his mother, Bob showed up at the attorney's office. As soon as he entered the office, he immediately apologized. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Excuse me? There's no way I'm forgiving this. But I did it for Catherine. He started with the same excuse. So I told him, submitting a fake marriage registration can be considered forging an official document, you know. Of course, that's just a possibility. It's uncertain if he'd actually be charged with a crime. But as a threat, it worked wonders. Bob apologized again. I'm sorry. Please. I don't want to go to jail. Too bad. Reflect on what you did. With that, Bob broke down in tears. Later on, in court, Bob confessed to forging the marriage certificate. I assume he testified that way, hoping to get leniency. However, life isn't that easy. Although he wasn't prosecuted, it didn't change the fact that he committed a crime. In the end, Bob lost his job and became an outcast in the community. Whenever people saw him in public, they whispered behind his back. Unable to take the ostracism, he moved to a small town. Now, he's scraping by, working part-time in a warehouse. While I'm not ready to think about remarrying, I do want a fulfilling personal life. Things with Paul are looking pretty good, to be honest. If and when I feel ready to move on from the divorce, I'll think positively about it.